Why did the Russians invade Ukraine? What is this all about? We have all heard the Russians claim Ukraine joining NATO is a security threat, but why is that? Why is Ukraine so important to the Russians? Is there any objectivity in this claim, or are the Russians simply not willing to let a former ally turn to the West? Welcome to The Sovereign Thinker. In today's episode, we'll be discussing Russia's geopolitical realities and whether Ukraine joining NATO is a threat to Russian security. Please like and subscribe and enjoy the video. A nation's geography determines its destiny. This is an old expression that states a nation's physical terrain plays a pivotal role in its historical and strategic outcomes. Though there are other factors that influence national decisions, it's important to always keep in mind the fundamental role geography plays in forming national identities, perceptions, and even policies, which includes war. Russia is a perfect textbook example of this. Its history is abundant with this geopolitical principle. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Russia is massive. There's no denying this. But despite its size, Russia is incredibly vulnerable. And it all comes down to geography. The heart of Russia, its historical core, or the heartland, includes modern-day European Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Baltic states. It's where the majority of Russians live. It's where most of their cities are located. It's where the Russians historically originated from. However, this entire area has always had Moscow in panic mode, and here's why. To understand why this region is so vulnerable, we need to look at two critical geographical features that define this heartland. On one side, we have the northern European plain, which stretches from northern France across Germany and Poland and opens up like a funnel into this massive open space that is the heartland. And on the other side, we have the Great Eurasian Steppe, which stretches all the way from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. The European plain coming from the west, the Eurasian Steppe coming from the east, meet or connect in this massive area, and all three of these geographical areas are marked by two obvious features. It's all flat and open, meaning there are no natural barriers, no mountains, no deserts, no oceans or seas to act as natural borders. Essentially, it's two super highways that connect in this one big open space. Highways that make it incredibly easy for invading armies to move across and invade the heartland. Russian history is defined by the many armies that have moved across these highways and straight into the heartland. Most notable or obvious examples are the Mongols, who came from the Eurasian Steppe, Napoleon, who came from the European plain, and Hitler, who also exploited the European plain. Since there are no barriers and these plains are super easy to traverse across, each invasion was absolutely devastating. There's nothing to stop an advancing army from moving straight into the highly exposed Russian territory. This brings us to the crux of Russia's security concerns or vulnerabilities. While Russia is difficult to hold and many have tried and many have failed, it's still easy to invade, which is a problem in of itself because nobody wants enemy soldiers roaming freely across their land, pillaging and destroying everything in their path. Each time this happens to Russia, cities are leveled, people are displaced or killed, and economies are shattered. To add to this desperate situation, when there are no natural barriers, more often than not, your cities and towns and the very people who live in these places are your only defense. That means turning towns into fortresses and sacrificing human lives to slow the enemy down. This has been Russia's reality for centuries, and it's an absolutely brutal and unsustainable way to defend a nation. Each invasion brings with it devastation, and no country can function in the long term with such vulnerability hanging over its head. So, what does Russia do about this? Russia's historical solution has been expansion. It's conquer or be conquered. Russia needed to push its borders out as far as possible until it found natural barriers that could shield it from invasions. Over the centuries, Russia painstakingly expanded outward, pushing its borders to the Altai Mountains in the east, to the Pacific Ocean in the far east, the Iranian Plateau, the Caucasus Mountains to the south, and the frozen Arctic to the north, and Crimea in the Black Sea. If you ever wondered How did Russia get so big? Well, the answer to this question is that its expansion was driven by the primal need of all nations: security. And once Russia found these barriers, they rarely went beyond them. If you look at a map of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, as well as this topographical map, you will notice that the borders align with these geographical barriers. But despite all this expansion, one vulnerability remained: the northern European plain. It's the eternal Achilles heel of Russian geography, and it remains a focal point of Russian security to this day. No matter how far the Russians pushed their borders westward, Western powers were still able to march right through Poland and into the heartland. And a fun fact, Poland in most Slavic languages is called Polska, meaning the land of fields and plains, which amply describes Poland's reality, being a country sitting almost entirely on the northern European plain. And since Russia is exposed to the European plain, which stretches all the way from northern France to the heartland and is approximately 600 kilometers wide, again, historically, there's not much Russia could do here. No matter how far they pushed their borders, they were still vulnerable. It was simply something the Russians had to accept as an unchangeable reality. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia found itself at rock bottom. Once the epicenter of a superpower was now economically shattered, politically unstable, and militarily weakened. But most importantly, Russia's carefully acquired geographical buffers were mostly gone, meaning Russia was once again exposed. Instead of falling into panic mode, a surprising sense of optimism swept through Moscow. For the first time, Russian leaders believed there was a real shot at building a fresh, unified European security framework. This meant Russia's vulnerable western borders could finally be secure. The vast, flat terrain of the northern European plain, Russia's historic Achilles heel, no longer would be an open invitation for invasion, as all European countries will be a part of the same European security framework, essentially overcoming all Russian security risks associated with their stubborn geography. As we all know, this did not happen. NATO expanded eastward. Former Soviet allies like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined the alliance in 1999. Additionally, in the same year, NATO unilaterally attacked Serbia without UN approval, and in 2004, another wave of expansion. Then in 2009, again in 2017, and in 2020. NATO's infrastructure continued to move eastward along the European plain, closer to Russia's borders and within the heartland itself. All that was left was Ukraine. In 2013, the Euromaidan protests erupted in Ukraine, leading to the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. To Moscow, this looked like a Western-backed coup designed to pull Ukraine, who sits within the heartland, firmly into the ever-expanding arms of NATO. Then came Crimea, a red line like no other. Crimea, though a part of Ukraine at the time, was one of the few geographical barriers Russia still held onto after losing the majority of the other barriers when the Soviet Union collapsed. By leasing the port of Sevastopol from Kiev, Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based in Sevastopol. Losing Crimea wouldn't just mean losing a warm water port or a naval base, it would mean losing a strategic shield that is the Crimean Peninsula, which has high ridges to the southeast of the peninsula and defensible coastlines that ultimately protect Russia's entire southern flank. So in the following year, in 2014, Russia made its move. It annexed Crimea swiftly and decisively. There was no waiting, no negotiating with the West or Kiev over this. Crimea was a natural barrier Moscow was not willing to risk, and so it acted without hesitation. Regarding the rest of Ukraine, what's important to understand is the border between the two countries. If you were on the ground following this border of both Russia and Ukraine, you will notice there is nothing marking one side or the other. Nothing there but open terrain and perhaps a few towns and villages. The border is completely imaginary, ultimately just lines on a map. The same thing is true with Russia's borders with Belarus and the Baltic states. There are no real-world signs showing the beginning or end of each country, and if Ukraine were to join NATO, de jure or de facto, suddenly Moscow would have to contend with a security alliance that stretches along this open border all the way from Estonia down to Ukraine, a 2,000-kilometer stretch with no geographical barriers to protect it. No amount of weaponry, manpower, or resources can defend such a large and flat open border. In fact, no other state in existence would have such a military vulnerability of this scale or magnitude. And to add on to this, Moscow would be facing the most powerful military alliance in the world, who possesses some of the most advanced weaponry. To protect herself and to reduce military spending, Russia needs to have Ukraine neutral. A neutral Ukraine would reduce this exposure down to only the Baltics and the borders between Poland, Belarus, and Kaliningrad. Still, not an ideal scenario for Moscow, but most definitely manageable as long as Ukraine is neutral. In fact, those who claim Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine need to understand one thing. It's actually in Russia's interest for Ukraine to remain neutral. If Ukraine were absorbed by Russia, Moscow would now have to contend with an even larger border with NATO. The border with Poland would double and would also include Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, who all have sophisticated militaries, which means Russia would have to focus massive amounts of manpower, weaponry, and resources to bolster those borders. With Ukraine neutral, Moscow would only have to worry about one half of the Polish border and the Baltic states, a much easier circumstance to handle. Another important factor we must take under consideration is the Volgograd Gap. Directly to the east of Ukraine's border is called the Caucasus region, where the Volgograd Gap stretches to the Kazakh border. This gap holds immense strategic value as it leads to Russia's last geographical barrier, the Caucasus Mountains, assuming Crimea had already been absorbed by NATO. Should an external force gain significant control over Ukraine and manage to block the passage through the Volgograd Gap, Russia would face dire consequences. Such a scenario would isolate Russia by severing its links to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and without its last geographical barrier, Russia would be totally exposed on all sides, ultimately putting the very existence of Russia into question. If you ever wondered why the Soviets fought like hell at Stalingrad against the Germans, well, now you know. If Ukraine were absorbed by NATO, the West wouldn't even have to take the Volgograd Gap. Just having it in NATO's crosshairs is enough to have Russia kneel to US dominance. Is Ukraine joining NATO de facto or de jure a security threat to Russia? The answer is undeniably yes. The European plain, which opens into the heartland and where both Russia and Ukraine sit, offers no protection for Moscow. If Ukraine and Crimea were absorbed into NATO, a key geographical barrier would be lost. The Black Sea would be a NATO sea, and the Volgograd Gap would be there for the taking. So when you hear Russians talk about security threats, now you know what they mean. When you hear someone argue that NATO provoked Russia, now you understand why this is true. When you hear NATO claim innocence, now you know there was nothing innocent about their expansion. Thank you for listening. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Ciao for now.